Hello and welcome to Uncivil Society. I'm Tom Watson. If you work in nonprofits, philanthropy, advocacy, or civil society, or if you simply care about democracy, you already know this. 2025 was not a normal year. It was a year when civil society didn't just struggle, it was targeted. This episode is about the 10 most important stories shaping U.S. civil society and philanthropy in 2025 and what they tell us about where we are, how fragile our institutions have become, and what comes next. These are in no particular order. I'm going to go from 10 to 1, but number 10 may be the worst, but I don't want to close with it. Story number 10, civil society under political attack. Let's start with the obvious. For the first time in modern U.S. history, a presidential administration treated the nonprofit sector itself as the enemy. The Trump administration didn't just oppose certain causes, it questioned the legitimacy of civil society altogether. Labeled nonprofits as partisan actors, threatened 501c3 nonprofit status, attacked watchdogs, legal aid groups, and journalists, created enemies lists, sent the government officials, whether DOJ attacks or the Department of Justice, against unfavored nonprofit institutions, and framed independent institutions as obstacles to their own power. This wasn't policy disagreement, it was delegitimization. It was malign, it was intentional, and it is continuing. Story number 9, the dismantling of USAID. The effective destruction of USAID was one of the most consequential and honestly one of the least discussed important events of the year. Decades of humanitarian infrastructure were hollowed out in months. Global health programs, food security networks, democracy and human rights work. This wasn't reform, it was abandonment. And in many places, in my view, it was simply a crime against humanity. According to the Center for Global Development, the cuts have already cost between 500,000 and 1 million lives around the world in the poorest possible places, where ironically, our dollars go the furthest. Civil society around the world felt the shockwaves, and frankly, there is no sign that it will recover anytime soon. Story number 8, the collapse of the government nonprofit partnership. For 60 years or more, the American social contract relied on a basic agreement. Government funds, nonprofits deliver, and communities benefit. In 2025, that compact fractured. Contracts were delayed, payments stalled, programs were politicized or defunded outright. Nonprofits were told to do more with less and then punished for speaking out or for just continuing to do the work. They were peppered with complaints about DEI or being too woke or serving the wrong communities. They had major grants canceled. This will leave a major economic hangover in 2026. Closely related, story number 7, fundraising in an age of fear and volatility. Let's be blunt, 2025 was difficult for fundraising. Some donors pulled back, some foundations delayed decisions. Government dollars became unreliable and boards grew risk averse at exactly the wrong moment. Many organizations survived, of course, but only by burning staff, draining reserves, abandoning their long-term strategy. They scrambled. I saw it very, very close up with clients, with organizations that I serve on the board of, and through colleagues who are out there trying to do the work in very, very difficult circumstances. Frankly, the resilience that the nonprofit sector did display in 2025 came at a cost, and I think that we will continue to see what that cost is in the year ahead. Story number 6, philanthropy pushback begins. Now, this to me is a positive story. It's where the story shifts a little bit. In 2025, something important happened. Organized philanthropy, to some degree, pushed back against the worst excesses of the administration. Foundation leaders, nonprofit CEOs, and institutional donors began to say publicly and clearly that civil society matters, democracy matters, and neutrality does not necessarily mean silence. To name a few people, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation President Rich Besser, Vera Institute President Nick Turner, Marguerite Casey Foundation CEO Carmen Rojas, Cal Wellness CEO Richard Tate, and repeatedly throughout the year, MacArthur Foundation President John Palfrey, and others. They began to speak out. Honestly, it was not enough, but it was a start. I think too many people are still silent, and some are giving to things like, oh, the ballroom that the administration is trying to build after tearing down a historic portion of the White House, things like that. It wasn't enough, but it was a start, and I was glad to see it. Story number 5. We've reached the halfway point here. And I'll take a sip of tea with that from my WFUV mug. Okay, thus refreshed. Story number 5 is the weakness of liberal institutions was exposed. Courts, universities, philanthropy, big law, the press. In 2025, we learned how fragile liberal institutions really are when they're not actively defended. Too many institutions relied on norms that no longer held. Too many waited for someone else to lead. Too many decided to compromise with the forces that are actively attacking our sector. The result, too often, was paralysis. At the moment, leadership was most needed. Watch this space in 2026. Story number 4, the continued rise of billionaire philanthropy as a center of power. As public systems weaken, private wealth continues to step in. Billionaire philanthropy continued to grow apace in 2025, not just in scale, but in influence. These gigantic gifts, which are actively welcomed by everyone in our sector, including myself, but they do have a disproportionate amount of power versus the $100 that you're able to give at year end, or the $50 that I might contribute on Giving Tuesday. These giant gifts shape policy. They fund entire fields. They essentially decide what entire fields are going to be sometimes. And they're setting agendas once owned, at least in partnership with democratic institutions, with legislatures and executives elected around the country. There is a disproportionate amount of power on the side of billionaire philanthropy. And I think it raises an uncomfortable truth for everybody working in our sector. And frankly, we're all trying to get these gifts. So hopefully this doesn't cost any of the organizations I'm involved with their money. But civil society is becoming increasingly dependent on unelected wealth to survive. And I think we all need to make sure that our governance is such that experts decide how best to spend the wealth created by our society. Okay. Story number 3, legal aid, journalism, and advocacy on the front lines. Kind of a catch-all category here. But legal services organizations, investigative journalists, frontline advocates became the shock absorbers for democracy, often underfunded or unfunded. They defended immigrants. They challenged unlawful actions. They worked in underserved communities. They defended those perceived as weaker in our society. They told the truth when it was dangerous to do so. I do think that nonprofit journalism organizations and frankly efforts to sue the Trump administration in court were the 2 biggest success stories last year. As I said earlier, they did it while underfunded. They were attacked and they are exhausted. We need to support them in 2026. Story number 2, we're coming into the home stretch. A culture of violence, hate speech, and distrust is everywhere in our country. The growth of political violence, explicit hate speech, and conspiratorial thinking, which is everywhere, especially on the far right, had direct consequences for the strength and resilience of our civil society. Nonprofit leaders received threats, public servants resigned, community trust eroded, violent acts occurred. Moreover, the attempt ongoing at mass deportation, the sickening roundups, the abandonment of civil rights, the destruction of families and whole communities, the specter of masked men without warrants simply seizing people from the streets of America, that leaves a stain on what remains of this democracy, as does all the forms of hate speech that are just so prevalent everywhere these days. Civil society doesn't function in a climate of fear, or at least it doesn't function very well. And in 2025, fear was the point. Okay, story number 1, which kind of harkens back to my message from last week. Story number 1 is we're still here. Despite all of these challenges, despite the horrendous stories that we have seen throughout this year, our sector is still here. We are 10% of the American workforce just in the nonprofit side of things alone. Despite everything, nonprofits kept serving, advocates kept organizing, journalists kept reporting, donors kept giving, and communities kept showing up for each other. There's definitely no victory lap in 2025. I'm not sure there'll be one in 2026, but I'm hopeful that the political scales will at least balance to create a significant structural pushback. But there's no victory lap, not even close. But there was, I think, a growing resolve, a sense that the power arrayed against us um, is not without its limits. It's not all powerful. That we can push back, we can win in court, we can organize, we can continue to do the work. It's very, very difficult. But that quiet, stubborn insistence really, I think, shouts the fact that we're still here and that we're not done. So without question, 2025 exposed significant fault lines in American civil society. It's why I am doing this blog. That's what uncivil society means. This was the year civil society was attacked. 2026 must be the year that we respond strategically, collectively, and without illusion. That's what this podcast is all about. Thank you. I'm Tom Watson. Thanks for watching, and please stay in the fight.